Imagine standing in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert. There is almost nothing around you. No skyscrapers, no roads, no city. Just mountains, sand, and an enormous empty landscape. Now imagine that, instead of building a normal city here, someone decided to build something that sounds almost impossible. A city stretching for 170 kilometers, only 200 meters wide, rising 500 meters into the sky, and eventually designed to house 9 million people. No traditional roads, no cars, no urban sprawl, and almost everything powered by renewable energy. This wasn't science fiction. Saudi Arabia called it the line, and the country presented it as one of the most ambitious urban projects in human history. But there is a problem. Today the question isn't simply, can Saudi Arabia build the line? The much more interesting question is, what happened to it? Because the project that once promised to completely redefine the modern city has now entered a very different reality. And the story behind that change is even more fascinating than the original vision. To understand what happened, we have to go back to 2017. Saudi Arabia was trying to transform its economy. For decades, the country's enormous wealth had been closely connected to oil. But Saudi Arabia's leadership wanted something different. A future where technology, tourism, manufacturing, entertainment, renewable energy, and investment could become much more important. This became part of Vision 2030, and one of the biggest pieces of that vision was a massive development called NEOM. When NEOM was announced in 2017, Saudi Arabia said the project would receive more than $500 billion over the coming years from the Saudi government, the Public Investment Fund, and other investors. But NEOM wasn't supposed to be just one city. It was imagined as an enormous region in northwestern Saudi Arabia, covering around 26,500 square kilometers. And inside this giant region would be several futuristic developments. One of the most famous would eventually become the line. Then came the idea that shocked the world. Instead of building a traditional city that spreads outward, why not build one that stretches forward? The line was designed as an enormous linear structure, 170 kilometers long, 200 meters wide, 500 meters high, and eventually, 9 million people. Think about that. 9 million people living inside something only 200 meters wide. The official concept described a city without traditional roads or cars. Everything residents would need would supposedly be within a short walk. And a high-speed transportation system would connect the city from one end to the other, with an advertised end-to-end journey of around 20 minutes. Instead of spending an hour driving through traffic every morning, you would simply move vertically or horizontally through the city. The idea was not to improve the traditional city, it was to replace the traditional city model altogether. And this is where the line became so fascinating. The designers weren't simply thinking about buildings, they were thinking about an entirely different way of living. The city was supposed to use advanced data systems to predict what residents needed. The concept envisioned artificial intelligence and automated systems helping manage transportation, energy, water, and everyday services. The city would also be designed around renewable energy, with no traditional cars and a dramatically smaller infrastructure footprint. According to NEOM's own plans, only about 34 square kilometers of ground would be occupied by the entire 170-kilometer city, while 95% of the surrounding land was intended to be preserved for nature. On paper, it sounded almost perfect. A city where you don't need a car. A city where everything is nearby. A city built from scratch, rather than forced to adapt to infrastructure that is hundreds of years old. And perhaps most importantly, a city designed specifically for the future. But then came the hardest part. Actually building it. Building a skyscraper is already an enormous engineering challenge. Building a city that is 170 kilometers long is something completely different. Imagine constructing a structure longer than the distance between many major cities. Now imagine doing it through deserts, mountains, and difficult terrain. You need foundations, roads, power, water, factories, transportation systems, workers, supply chains, and thousands of individual construction projects that all have to work together. And there was another problem. The line wasn't supposed to be a single giant building. It was supposed to function as an entire city. That means hospitals, schools, universities, homes, entertainment, energy systems, water infrastructure, transportation, data networks, everything, all at the same time. And then there was the question everyone eventually had to ask: how many people would actually live there? Because designing a city for 9 million people is one thing. Finding 9 million people who want to live inside a 200-meter-wide megastructure in the Saudi desert is another. As the project moved forward, the gap between the enormous original vision and what could realistically be delivered became increasingly important. By 2025, reports indicated that the construction strategy for the line had been significantly scaled back. Reuters reported that work had been reduced toward a much smaller 2.4-kilometer section, rather than immediately building the full 170-kilometer vision. And that number tells you everything. 170 kilometers was the original vision. 2.4 kilometers was the much smaller near-term target. That's less than 2% of the original length. Suddenly, the question wasn't, when will the entire city be finished? It became, will the original city ever be built at all? And this is where the story gets even more interesting. In 2026, reporting indicated that further work on the mainline project had been delayed until at least after 2030, while Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund shifted more attention toward infrastructure and sectors with more immediate economic returns. A 2026 report from construction company Trevi also stated that its work packages connected to the line had been completed toward the end of 2025, and that the project was currently on hold. And that doesn't necessarily mean the line is officially dead. That's an important distinction. The project has not simply disappeared. Saudi Arabia still has the broader NEOM vision, but the original timeline and scale have clearly come under pressure. Instead of immediately creating the futuristic city shown in those spectacular computer-generated images, Saudi Arabia is now dealing with the much more difficult question of what can realistically be built, when, and at what cost. So why is a project with enormous financial backing still so difficult? Because money can solve many problems. But money doesn't eliminate physics. It doesn't eliminate geography, and it doesn't eliminate time. A 170-kilometer megastructure requires an extraordinary amount of coordination. Every section depends on another section. Every road, tunnel, power system, water network, and foundation has to be connected. And unlike building a normal city over decades, the line was designed around a completely new concept. There is no existing urban infrastructure to build upon. Everything has to be created from almost nothing. And then there's the climate. Saudi Arabia's desert environment brings extreme heat and difficult working conditions. Materials need to be transported across huge distances. Construction equipment has to operate in an environment that is very different from most major cities. And the bigger the project becomes, the more expensive every delay becomes. But perhaps the most interesting part of the line isn't whether it succeeds or fails. It's what the project tells us about the future of cities. Because the line was created around a very simple idea. What if we didn't have to build cities the way we've always built them? For more than a century, cities expanded outward. More roads, more cars, more suburbs, more traffic, more infrastructure. The line proposed the opposite. Build upward, build densely, connect everything, give people their time back, preserve the land around the city. In theory, it's revolutionary. And even if the original 170-kilometer vision never becomes reality, some of these ideas may survive. High-speed transportation, vertical urban design, renewable energy, automated infrastructure, smart cities, AI-powered services, and more efficient use of land. In that sense, the line could still influence the future, even if the city itself never looks exactly like the original renders. So, was the line a failure? It's too early to give such a simple answer. The original vision was extraordinary. The engineering challenge was enormous. The financial commitment was massive. And the timeline was incredibly ambitious, but the project has already changed. The 170-kilometer dream is no longer being pursued on the same immediate schedule that captured the world's imagination. And that's what makes the line such a fascinating story. Because this isn't simply a story about a futuristic city. It's a story about what happens when human ambition meets reality. Saudi Arabia wanted to build a city that looked like it belonged in the next century. Now the world is watching to see how much of that vision can actually become real. Maybe the line will eventually return in a different form. Maybe parts of it will become the foundation for something completely different. Or maybe future generations will look back at those enormous renders as one of the boldest architectural visions that was never fully realized. We don't know yet. But there is one thing we do know. The line is no longer just a story about building the future. It's a story about how difficult the future is to build. And perhaps that's the real story behind the line. Not the shiny buildings, not the futuristic renders, not even the billions of dollars. But the question of whether we can actually turn an idea that looks impossible on a screen into something that works in the real world. Because sometimes, what's behind the world's biggest projects is even more fascinating than what we see on the surface. This is What's Behind.